The result of Indian slavery, like I was speaking about, put many indigenous people on plantations or indentured to businesses and farms with African, European, Eastern Indian, and even South Pacific people. This merge of people or intermingling creates the current African American and American Indian population. Most African American people have American Indian ancestry, in my opinion. And American Indians are related to these people, or they are the same people. And there's a whole controversy about that, about certain family members being enrolled in tribes and then darker skinned family members not being included on those rolls. And those one group of people, the darker skinned people, might be considered as African American, and then the lighter people on the rolls, they're American Indian, but they're of the same bloodline. So you have that dynamic going on. There are some people labeled as African American who have more American Indian ancestry than some Native Americans enrolled in recognized tribes. Welcome, this is TashaXi, and I'm the instructor for Tracing American Indian and African American Genealogy. In this class, we're going to cover the background history of genealogy of American Indian and African American people, or people who descend from those people. So here's a brief history lesson. I'm trying to be under 15 minutes, so you can just get a little gist and be able to be comfortable with the information that you're receiving. Once you go into your search doing your genealogy, won't be that many surprises, and then you can kind of understand why certain things are written like they are, and why certain people are all lumped together under certain titles like Black, Negro, and Indian, mulatto, things like that. So you will see all those titles, like I spoke about before. You'll see all those titles for people of color, or either if you're American Indian or African American or both. So before colonization, there was no written genealogy records, allegedly. We only have oral history coming from the tribes or family members associated with the tribes. In my family, some of the oral tradition about our tribal identity was told to me at an early age, which helped me tremendously in my search. Groups belonging to the 5 civilized tribes have rolls, which are list of families that applied to the U.S. government to be recognized as members of their tribe or tribes under the treaties with the American government that they were associated with. So if some people are lucky enough, they will find their ancestors on these Indian rolls that are readily available on the internet or in libraries. So once again, let's go over that. Before colonization, there was no written records. We had family clans. So some of the surnames are actually the clan names. And that applies to America, Europe, even Africa, different places. Your surname was your clan name, or it could be like an angelized, or it can be an English, it can be an English version of your indigenous name. And we also have both matrilineal and patrilineal societies within this certain type of genealogy. American Indians were matrilineal people. Now, matrilineal means that we go by descendancy of the female line, correct? Patrilineal would be European society. in certain African societies, in which we see, for example, with European society, we go by the patrilineal, which is the male family clan name. So, for example, in Europe, they have the McDonald's. Now, McDonald's is not just a restaurant. It's not just a last name, but it was an actual tribe or clan in Europe. So you have the McDonald's, you have Andersons, you have different Johnsons, different groups like that, which were tribes. Okay, those were clans. And then we also had oral history to supplement our knowledge of our family before colonization. So you would hear stories about your grandma would tell you stories about who her mother was, who her grandmother was, who her father was, etc. down the line. And there might be a little story to it, or it could be kind of a figurative story or a story about an actual family member. So those are some of the things that we had before colonization. And we had, in America, we had totems, which was your patrilineal line, the story of them and the clans within your father's side. And then we had other stories for, your actual clan, which was on your mother's side. Say your mother was Bear Clan, you would be Bear Clan, and you would know all about Bear Clan. And then maybe an English interpretation of Bear Clan, because bears are brown. Some people might have been the Brown family. That would be their clan. And Brown was also a name of a European clan. So sometimes certain names like that, you can't really tell the origin without doing a lot of genealogy work to figure out who you are. Or you could have inherited the name Brown due to enslavement or due to just deciding to pick that name because you didn't have a surname at the time. So it's all different types of elements. That's why we have to do the work. So Virginia and Massachusetts, these are two very important territories within genealogy in British North America. They were the beginnings of British North America, the first colony being Jamestown Colony or Virginia Colony, and then the second being Massachusetts or Plymouth Colony. They had Jamestown Plantation, and they also had Plymouth Plantation. And it's also important to know that plantation wasn't just a place where slaves were. Plantations were estates or tracts of land where people lived. Either a person or family owned it, or the actual crown owned that land. So that's what a plantation was. And if you really want some tea, a lot of those plantations were built on top of indigenous American villages. Okay. So that's something else to look into. When you're doing your genealogy, you might find an ancestor who was enslaved on a certain plantation. I'll give an example of the Nazantico tribe in Virginia. The Nazantico tribe lived in a certain area. Present day, I believe it's present day King George County, Virginia. And they had a town over there. And that town, the people, the Nazantico, were put on trial, and they were all given the sentence of being enslaved. And the children were taken and put on these plantations, which used to be the actual town that they lived in, while their parents were shipped off and enslaved in Antigua. So they built right on top of that town. They built a mansion, which is still there, called Belgrove. But I digress. It's a whole totally different story. But that's just a case study or an example of certain genealogy that certain information of the background history might be important, because you might be figuring out how that person got there or what their ethnic origin is. And then you can go back and look at the actual laws and the case of the Nazantico and see the names of the children who were listed on there and who were indentured or enslaved on those plantations. So the two locations were the start of colonization in British North America. Many people will be able to trace their ancestors to records in these places. New England ancestry might be found in Massachusetts files. In the South, most people from Mississippi, Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and the Carolinas, etc., will trace their ancestry back to Virginia, especially African Americans and American Indians from the East Coast due to enslavement, indentured servitude, and forced migrations from the East. So that is very important right there. Just because you know your grandma's from Mississippi doesn't necessarily mean all your ancestors are from Mississippi. They might go back to Virginia or could be the Carolinas. But in many cases that I've seen, they go back to Virginia. And Virginia was one of the largest domestic ports of slaves and received large amounts of immigrants before Ellis Island. So those are two other key things that are very important in genealogy. So it doesn't really matter what race you are. If your family is from the Americas as a colony, from North America as a colony or British North America, you might possibly find records in Virginia or Massachusetts. So the further you go back, you need to keep that in mind. Okay, trade migrations. Now, trade migration is very important since genealogy is the process of forming an assumption. It's very important to assume that those trade migration routes have some indication of why your family moved from an area or why they moved into an area. For example, the Cherokee, it is known that the Cherokee moved from up north down into areas like the Carolinas, Virginia, the western coast of Virginia, and in Georgia to come down and trade with the Spanish and the English. Okay, so that's also important to know. Also within trade of the domestic slave trade, you will know that as some people have found, they have ancestors who were enslaved in Virginia and were moved with, either they were freed or they moved with their master to a different part of the South, or to St. Louis or Ohio. A lot of people moved to Ohio when they became free, so that's why trade migration is very important. And right here, this is just like an example of British North America. All this, let's see, the pink part, the blue part, and the yellow part, pretty much the British had control of at a certain point of time. So if you're looking at records in English, that is what you will find. Now, some people who are in Georgia, Carolinas, and Florida, certain areas like that, Louisiana, some of their records are going to be in Spanish and possibly French. I believe New York might have Dutch records and areas like that as well. So you might not be able to find everything, but it's good to know that it's possibly available to you. According to dictionary.com, colonization is the action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. The indigenous peoples of various areas have been affected by colonization, and it's had a big impact on the genealogy of all people on this planet. But we are mainly focusing on North America in this course, okay? So you see that colonization, the trading, and the migration is connected and very important in genealogy to know these things. So the trading and migration is very key. People were sold and they were moved around. People moved with the trade routes, and they also moved with the Homestead Act and things like that. They moved to go there, farm, and cultivate, and be able to trade and make a living. Okay, but the families of people who may have only used oral history to remember ancestors now have some members documented in various treaties, war records, and vital statistics. And that's due to these trading and migration and colonization. So that might be one of the few positive things about colonization, is that we have these records documented, and we know that they're available to us, okay, for free most of the time, unless you're dealing with state archives. All right. Indian and African Wars. The Indian Wars led to many people being taken and enslaved. The people were shipped to different parts of the colony, or the West Indies, and even Europe and Africa. People were stripped of their tribal identity, and whole tribes were enslaved and moved around. The wars in Africa led to hundreds of thousands of people being shipped to the Americas. So this right here, these wars had a big impact on people of color specifically, and also European people, because they were traded as well. So it's important to know just this little background information, that certain people might have been captured and migrated or moved around because of these wars. And also the treaties after these wars, especially talking about American Indian ancestry. Some of the treaties, like I mentioned before, list your actual ancestors on them who signed the treaty. And for example, one of my ancestors, known to the English as Queen Anne, she is documented on the Treaty of Middle Plantation in Virginia. Okay, so you'll see the people's name, and then you can get a little bit of idea. They might describe them a little bit, and then seeing that, you'll, know where to look for other information about them, or just knowing the lifestyle that your ancestors lived. Even if they're not on the treaty, they could have been a part of that group of people, and just knowing what they had to go through based on reading those treaties. All right, and this is a map right here, and you can get a little idea of the migration and the trade routes that they used here. A lot of these routes are in the wars as well. You see the French and Indian War on here, the Indian Wars. You see the slave trade. So all these different things here. Right here you can see the blue lines, and the blue lines indicate the domestic slave trade. Okay, this would include American Indian slaves right here. And then you see the lines that are in black are the slaves that were traded from the Caribbean. And then the red lines are the slaves who were traded from Africa. So there's also important to know that the Indian Wars in America also led to a lot of American Indian, specifically men, being enslaved and taken and traded to the Caribbean. Then also being brought back up through the route where it says the Caribbean, to be traded once again. And then from them coming back from the Caribbean, they could have been traded around within the domestic trade, or they could have stayed wherever they were imported. But it's important just to have this little background information so that you know that it's a possibility that one of your ancestors could have been found in the Caribbean or anywhere else, So the result of Indian slavery, like I was speaking about, put many indigenous people on plantations or indentured to businesses and farms with African European, Eastern Indian, and even South Pacific people. This merge of people or intermingling creates the current African American and American Indian population. Most African American people have American Indian ancestry, in my opinion. And American Indians are related to these people, or they are the same people. And there's a whole controversy about that, about certain family members being enrolled in tribes and then darker skinned family members not being included on those rolls. And those one group of people, the darker skinned people, might be considered as African American. And then the lighter people on the rolls, they're American Indian, but they're of the same bloodline. So you have that dynamic going on. There are some people labeled as African American who have more American Indian ancestry than some Native Americans enrolled in recognized tribes. And that's exactly what I was just speaking of. The whole colorism and certain issues that went on in the background of the history of these people. Nat Turner's rebellion has a big part to do with that as well, because certain people retreated from being identified with that same group of people, and they kind of try to cut off certain family members that would get them in trouble or treated the same way as they were treated with the black codes and different laws and things that went down. It's, it's a whole lot of stuff to cover, but I'm trying to get everything in. And then there are also people who are labeled as white who have significant amount of African and American Indian ancestry. That's why genealogy is so important, and why you need to do your research to find out who your ancestors were. We can't just assume anymore that we're all the same and we all come from the same place, because as people actually do the work and do the genealogy, they're finding that it's not true. So don't assume that you are what you are labeled today and that you do not have ancestry from other cultures. Leave no stone unturned in your genealogy research. That's very important. And there's also the myth that all so-called black people with indigenous ancestry are descended from slaves owned by the 5 civilized tribes or runaway African slaves. This is not true for many people. Not all African Americans or American Indians were enslaved. There are many documented free people of color, which free and integrated American Indians and African Americans were listed under. In some cases, they are the same people. All people who were not white were listed as Negro, mulatto, or colored. In some cases, there were people of color listed as white on records. These people are usually big landowners or well off, okay? And some of them might have been lighter complexion and being able to pass as white, basically. Treaties, policies, black codes, and paper genocide. So treaties created an environment where indigenous people agreed to become Indian slave hunters and to return runaway African and Indian slaves. The fact that some of these tribes, like the Nottoway and Powhatan Confederacy, refused to hunt fellow indigenous people to trade for slaves or to turn in runaways caused friction with the government. Certain tribes, like the Yamasee and Seminoles, were even involved in raiding plantations and freeing enslaved Indians, Africans, and Europeans, which some of these people were adopted, or the freed enslaved tribal members were reinstated within the tribe. And then there was black codes created to control the people the free people of color, and also the slave people. These were put on top of the policies already created to put the woodland tribes in subjugation on the East and Gulf Coast. These policies placed both American Indian and African people in the same categories, in which they received the same treatment in Western society and within the slave system. The vital statistics and other records further confuse and mix up the classification of these people, creating paper genocide. One of the most famous cases of paper genocide of indigenous people occurred in Virginia in the early 1900s with Walter Plecker, who was a eugenist and an institutional racist. He was actually also a consultant to the Nazis, so that just tells you he's a baddie, right? There was also the need to pass, as I mentioned before, for certain people of fair complexion, for them to pass as white, to avoid racial discrimination of non-white people in the Reconstruction period and the turn of the century as well. So some quote-unquote white people have a decent amount of American Indian and African DNA in them. So that is also important to know if you're searching ancestors. Maybe your ancestor, you might have thought that they were white or European, and you come to find out that they were mixed with different groups. You know, so it's anything is possible when doing your genealogy. And that's why I find it so exciting personally, because you can find all these, it's so many, just in your own bloodline, there's so many different amazing stories and amazing people. Everyone doesn't have to be a king or a chief or celebrity, famous writer, W.E.B. Du Bois or somebody. Just regular Joe that was a farmer, or Susie who was a stay-at-home mom or whatever. There's exciting stories in all of your ancestors. And all of your ancestors are very important, and they make you who you are. So be proud. All right. So I hope you got a little bit of more of a understanding of this and background information on, on genealogy, and you'll be able to be ready to hit the floor running.